Maybe just before we start, I know not everybody is very familiar with the background of this series, so I'll just share a little bit of the background of how we got here. In 2021, the Outcome and Agenda report was released by the Secretary General of the UN. And as you recall, there were 99 plus recommendations that were proposed by the Secretary General to address challenges to the multilateral order. And in response to that report, we started hosting these off-the-record breakfast meetings to address the multifaceted challenges ahead in an effort to create a space for all the stakeholders to dialogue with one another in the legal advocacy of the future. Thank you.
Is this better? And more audible? Perfect. So we have now entered the implementation phase of the Pact for the Future. And in that pact, under Action 13C, the member states request that the Secretary General provide analysis on the impact of the global increase in military expenditure on the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals by the end of the 79th session, so this current session of the General Assembly. And earlier this year, on January 30th, the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs launched a call for papers to encourage engagement and reflection on the impact of the global increase in military expenditure on the achievement of the SDGs by member states, think tanks, youth, and civil society organizations. So the call for papers has been launched, and everybody's encouraged to send them in by the 1st of March. In the same call, however, UN ODA also encouraged stakeholders to organize events and discussions on this topic to contribute to the Secretary General's analysis. So the outcomes of these discussions and these events will be posted on delegated webpage. And today's gathering is one effort in response to this call from UN ODA. So we all know that the high levels of military spending come at a very high cost. Just in 2023, CPRI calculated that world military spending had reached $2.4 trillion. In 2024, the Financing for Sustainable Development report estimated that SDG financing and investment gaps were between 2.5 and 4 trillion USD annually. So through today's discussion, I'm looking forward to hearing all of your reflections and insights on how we can address the issue of increasing militarization while recognizing that that this is a highly complex issue globally. So with this in mind, I will give the floor over to Michael Collins, the Executive Director for the Americas for IEP. Over to you, Michael.
Excellent. Thank you, Lily. And if it's okay, I'm a bit more of a shouter, so I'm just going to push this back. So in a perfect world, of course, there wouldn't be any need for police or jails or even judicial systems, let alone military investment and military intervention. Of course, this is not a perfect world. I don't need to share many examples or stats related to that, perhaps just one in addition to the one that Lily shared. The cost of violence in 2023 was equivalent to $19.1 trillion. The largest percent of that, almost 75% of that, is actually what we call violence containment, essentially. So that would be the money that is dedicated to things like judicial systems, private security, and militarization. So militarization in itself accounts for about 45% of that overall cost. The SDGs, however, themselves don't, call specifically for investments in militarization, let alone security. So the closest thing that gets to it is, I suppose, SDG 16A, which talks about strengthen relevant institutions to prevent violence and combat terrorism and crime. Now, of course, it may be inherent to a lot of the other sort of points in there, and it doesn't take much of sort of a mental leap to kind of sort of make the case that as and when sustainable development goals are achieved, the need to invest in security and the need to invest in militarization goes down, that essentially the social environment provides the improved social environment provides a form of security guarantee. The problem, I suppose, is that we're not actually that good at sustainable development either. Sustainable development has, according to the Secretary General's latest report, stalled, regressed. And that comes at a time in which, until very recently, levels of militarization had actually been reducing around the world as well. Of course, there's a lot of nuance there, and you can unpack that in a variety of different ways, including regionally, economic pathways, and I'm sure that there's a lot of keen findings that would come from that. But essentially, you know, the kernel, if you will, is that ongoing global inequity, unsustainable practices are driving instability that in turn leads to an increased military expenditure. So the SDG analysis and the people behind it have got the very unenviable task of trying to sort of unpack all of this a lot more. It may benefit from some acknowledgements, for example, the logical response of an increase in militarization in the face of increasing conflict, ongoing underinvestment in the SDGs, of course, and kind of sort of trying to sort of point out or advocate for the value in a sort of progressive change in the ratio, essentially, of investment in sustainable development compared to the military. So it's a difficult task, and case studies are always very helpful in that because they help tell stories, which is why I'm so absolutely delighted to be accompanied, as we all are today, by the Honorable Carlos Alvarado Quesada, 48th President of Costa Rica, former Labor and Social Security Minister for Costa Rica, to discuss specifically Costa Rica. Very, very unique story of the country, demilitarized constitutionally in 1949. Not a unique feature, but at least according to my understanding, one of the first countries to do so. Just a very quick note, other countries that share similar pathways, especially when it comes to being peaceful countries. Costa Rica is currently the most peaceful country in Central America and does well on many, many indicators, including the Human Development Report indicators. But other countries, Iceland, the most peaceful country in the world, Mauritius, another example of a country without a military, the most peaceful in the sub-Saharan African region. Carlos, thank you very much for your time today and welcome. We have a few questions lined up, which are kind of sort of the open questions that perhaps I can help add, or we can jointly help add some nuance to. But after this, I'd love to hand it back over to Dan, who's going to open it up to the floor for additional questions and comments on the topic. So Carlos, delving in, if you don't mind, into question one. The question is sort of what social aspects were in place for Costa Rica to demilitarize? And I think, given my void of context, please do feel free to sort of fill in about a bit about the history of Costa Rica. What social aspects were in place for Costa Rica to demilitarize, and how can that be replicated? Let me just add one additional point in here. Stabilization, going back to the point of military, stabilization is seen as a critical first step in being able to sort of put in place or have that environment in which sustainable development can develop. But at the same time, again, we're very bad at it, right? 1 out of 5 kind of efforts to do that and to create that environment essentially fails. So being able to understand that particular environment and what it led to the subsequent demilitarization and then the growth that we've seen in Costa Rica since would be critical in our view to be able to understand what needs to be done next. Carlos, please.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Lily, also, and Dan for the invitation. And thank you all for being here. And also thanks to the Baha'i. I feel almost adopted already. Usually when I come to New York, I spend some time here. So I might first tell a little bit on the story, the context of how that occurred, and then we can take the conversation of what happened afterwards and what are the current challenges. So in the 1940s was a very turbulent decade of last century all around the world, also in Costa Rica. At the beginning of that decade, during Second World War, Costa Rica was ongoing on a reform process, social reform process. And there was this very eclectic alliance between the Republican Party in Costa Rica, the Catholic Church, and the Communist Party. And those three actors built a coalition to enforce several social reforms. One being universal healthcare, adopted in 1941, the creation of the University of Costa Rica, 1940, the labor code that stipulated 8-hour jornada or workday, and several other institutions that changed the profile. We came from, let's say, liberal period to this social reform period at the early 1940s. So that happened there. In 1948, a couple of years afterwards, after an election, there is a conflict because of there's a call for fraud in the election, 1948. And that triggered an armed revolution. The revolution lasted like 45 days and roughly 3,000 people died in the conflict. But the Revolutionary Army expelled the government. The same government that had created those social reforms. So the Liberation Army came into power and formed a junta. And this junta ruled for 1 year on the country, drafted a new constitution. So I know so far this sounds very familiar, right? To what happens sometimes. But what did the leadership of that junta did? One thing, they did not change the social reform that was previously executed by their rivals. They kept that. Two, actually, they took that to another level. They created other institutions. They created the National Company of Electricity, publicly owned. They nationalized electricity. They nationalized the banks. So the reform, instead of going back, it went further. And one of the decisions by the junta that came to power through a coup was to abolish the army. They decided we abolish the army. Very counterintuitive. And then after 1 year in power, the junta lended power to the gentleman that was supposed to win the election. And the next election was held in 1953, won by Jose Figueres Ferrer, who was the leader of the revolution. So he came to power through this revolution. They drafted a new constitution. They gave power back, and then they went to elections. And in 1953, they came back to power. And that's the inauguration of the Second Republic in Costa Rica till our day. Some takeaways at this point. One, during turbulent times, good change is possible. Two, leadership matters. Ambition matters. All intuition or all typical knowledge or pathways will say, if you have a junta and you have power, you probably remain there. And you tell people you're indispensable for change. We have heard that very often, right? And you use the military to remain there. This was a completely different approach. Also, Figueres' thinking was, when they abolished the army, they had this intuition that proved to be right, that armies in our region, Latin America, in comparison to other regions of the world, conflict is not within countries as much as in other places. Conflict is within. Inequality within is the main problem, not necessarily conflict. But they knew that the army was an element of, not of stability, but of instability. That armies were used against citizens and to hold on to power. We know the model. So the bet was on taking away that element and to rely on other kinds of institutions. And ever since, Costa Rica has been one of the strongest endorsers of the rules-based system. Because that's what we endorse, the rule of international law, in order to work on international differences. Many people said that's impossible, it's crazy to do that. This is 1949. But here we are. I say that's the evidence of, here we are. And I share with Dan a paper, and he promised he will be circulating that. Recently, there's a paper from two Costa Rican economists analyzing the the economic outcome and benefit of the abolition of the army. It's estimated that from 1950 to 2010, the yield of abolishing the army in GDP, I know that's another conversation, but in GDP terms, it's between 1.4 and 2.2% of GDP annually of benefit by not having an army. Also, because what happened afterwards was that most of those resources were dedicated into education and healthcare. So instead of using that money to funding a standing army, tanks or artillery or whatever, that's used into human development. I mean, we're now a mid-income, but we were a poor country. And many argue that we were free riding on the protection of the US. That was the typical argument is, but it's because the US is going to bail you out in case you have any trouble. Well, in the region, in the Western Hemisphere, exists the TR, the Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance of the Organization of American States, which is a treaty that's created to, in case of any aggression, any country can appeal to it in order to receive the protection of the other countries. But as I have said, it's not been the case. Actually, the case was that armies were used for dictatorships, mostly. And that's the case from the 1950s. Well, there's at least 2 cases that come to mind to today. So that all human development proved to be right. And the reliance on the rule-based system. I emphasize that rule-based system too, because we talk a lot about multilateralism, and it's fine. But nobody outside this kind of forums really understands what multilateralism is and why it's useful. So when we say we need to defend multilateralism, people don't know what we're talking about. When we say we need to defend a system that has rules to protect, especially the most vulnerable, people say, that's important. When we say multilateralism, we're talking, nobody understands what we're talking about. So that's a little bit the story and what happened afterwards. And that actually triggered human development and made a difference for us. I mean, we were a very poor country. We're still not a wealthy one, but that connected with other things. We did not explode. We did not become an economy based on extraction of resources, even though we have oil or other minerals. But our model started to shift on a model based on human resource, as human capital as the base, and then the diversification out of need. So our main export good now is medical devices, for example. One of our main industry services, either in tourism or services to the region. And that shifted to a completely different model of human development. Our electricity is more than 95% clean and renewable to today, but it was from that moment that came. We don't rely on fossil fuels for our electricity. So that's the kind of thing that triggered that decision. But again, to this point, turbulent times can give you margin to make good decisions. Leadership matters, and also more and more, I just come from the Committee of Development Policy, which I'm part of recently. I'm more convinced now that it's not about implementing somebody else's formula, but it's coming with your own formula to fix things. And we preach a lot on saying, this is the developmental pathway. This is the diagnosis and this is the remedy. And I believe more that we need to liberate the space for people to think their own developmental pathway. But anyway, that also liberated fiscal margin. Now that we're in the finance for development discussion, that liberated some fiscal margin to do key investments for human development. And it's good for peace.
If you don't mind, Carlos, we're definitely going to unpack that, but I'd like to potentially just unpack a couple of more aspects. I had the honor of reading a dissertation from a colleague from the World Data Lab who specifically had done kind of sort of a differential study between, Honduras and Costa Rica, given the fact that in the initial, sort of reform period of the 1800s and onwards had very kind of sort of similar characteristics, if you will. And one of his kind of sort of main points was, in fact, to your point, that, once you have that junta power, that the aim is largely to remain there, right? And that invariably political parties will leverage the military to the extent that they can to stay in power. And also to your point, what you mentioned about, the leadership figure, and I think Dan, if he has not already recommended, will be recommending a podcast to explore that specifically in terms of Figueres as being a sort of a core leader along the lines of which you describe. But at the same time, going back to kind of sort of the need for there to be an environment that's conducive for those changes and proposals to be well accepted. The contention of my colleague was that the military at the time was not as kind of sort of developed as an institution as you would have seen perhaps in other countries already. And therefore the disbanding of the military may not be in such a crazy case. But at the same time, invariably, my feeling is that people's lot would have had to be a lot better, right? Generally speaking, to also kind of sort of accept these changes and these reforms, right? That invariably, despite having lived through a recent civil war, people felt safe enough and secure enough to be able to kind of sort of, follow that leadership vision. So I just wondered if you could comment a bit on that, but maybe segue straight into sort of the second question and the second point that you tried to start making, which is how has long-term development investments contributed to its long-term security, especially if, for example, part of the Secretary General's analysis is to try and sort of make the case for sustainable development as a security building tool.
Yeah. Well, there's nothing more and more that I think about this kind of things. There's finding just one cause or source of causality can be very deceiving. World is so multifactorial, there's so many variables. That's why it's so difficult to see scenarios repeating themselves throughout history. We see different mixes of, but it's true that the army was not, there was an army, but as an institution was not strengthened, particularly because 20 years before that, there was a dictatorship in Costa Rica, supported by the army. But at that time, the dictators, let's say, through social pressure, flee the country. There was no conflict there. So people were, after in those 20-year periods, were not keen to invest on the army. But there's another key difference, and this is also good to put out there. If you look at the Caribbean and Central America region, the only country that did not have US military presence in one way or another was Costa Rica. We never had that presence, either through direct intervention or eventually, as in the case of Guatemala was afterwards, CIA intervention or a big company intervention. We were, let's say, lucky, or we managed to maneuver not to have that. So there was not a tradition of training our own military with that approach. That approach is still having an impact in part of the region. So I think that's also a key element to put in the table. If you put a map of that same region and you color it, there's just a few dots that are not colored with military presence from outside. So that's a key element. On to the investments afterwards, I think you need to nourish this. I mean, you need bursts of creativity and to push development, but also some stability to keep that flight going. And that happened, that occurred. Some of those institutions remain in place. As I mentioned, the social security started to expand. So you see that period with dramatic expansion of life expectancy to today even higher than the US and compared to Europe. You see the access to electricity, which is again more than almost 99% of population with access to electricity, similar to water. So that demonstrates that you don't need to necessarily be that wealthy to provide certain services for the population. I'm not saying it's perfect. I've been there. I've run the country. I know all of the other things that are not going necessarily well. But it's true that gives lots of margin, both politically and some economically, to advance. And also in education, we put ourselves the target to invest 8% of our GDP in education. So in that period from 1950 to the 1980s, there was a big expansion of human welfare, human mobility across. Then the crisis hit all Latin America, including Costa Rica. And there was like the lost decade. But let's say that you were able to catch up in the trajectory. Now we're struggling with other of those challenges. But it's kind of what the ride has been so far.
Yeah. It's not often that you can say, I've been there, I've run the country. So I think which is exactly why I think your testament is kind of sort of so key to this ongoing discussion. You did make a sort of a quick passing reference to security guarantees, whether those be from the United States or alternatively via mechanisms in the OAS or the Rio Treaty, which is kind of sort of essentially the equivalent of NATO Article 5, from what I understand. Especially given the increase in conflict that we are sort of seeing, and of course, the impact that would have in any case on Costa Rica would be kind of sort of immediately different and is perhaps not a consideration. But could you kind of sort of open up perhaps as to what potential challenge, if any, the country has seen either by not being as sovereign as it would like to, or alternatively sacrifices that it's had to make on the kind of sort of militarization, or let me broaden that, security front?
Well, one decision also at the beginning, and it's also key to understand this, while we abolished the army, at the same time the army was abolished, the Communist Party was prohibited. That was one trade-off. And I think it was sending a message abroad, let's say it lightly, to say we're taking this reform system, but we're not becoming part of the communist bloc. That was kind of the trade-off, saying we're going a very progressive developmental route, but we're not aligning with at that time with the socialist bloc. So that was a key trade-off. In 1970, that Communist Party was again institutionalized, or was permitted to participate on the elections. The experience was that actually it gave us some margin to maneuver diplomatically. Why? Because, and we saw that, for example, on the 80s, on the wars on Central America. Costa Rica declared neutrality first, then President Arias, who was given the Nobel Prize, and the Central American presidents negotiated locally, domestically, the peace plan, even with the pressure of President Reagan to keep trying to overthrow the regime in Nicaragua, the Sandinistas, until in the 90s, the Sandinistas in Nicaragua went to an open election, and the Sandinistas lost the election and recognized the result. Fast forward, that has changed dramatically recently, but that's another story. But there was an endogenous project to solve, a plan locally designed and crafted to solve, even with the support of the Contadora group, Venezuela, Mexico, and others. But there was a plan that was locally owned for peace that occurred in the 80s and 90s in Central America. Costa Rica had managed to maneuver in terms of its own security, but through diplomacy, using diplomacy as the tool to do that. Actually, our soft power in diplomacy we used recently for the treaty on, I always forget the name. The names are so complicated. The Treaty for Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, recently adopted in Costa Rica, chaired that. That also gave us margin to maneuver. We took the environmental route. It has given us the possibility to advocate for that. We were among the first ones, if not the first ones, to do environmental services in the 90s, before when that was thought to be crazy. Now we talk about environmental services of ecosystems to society, everybody understands. But that was done in the 90s. We launched, under my administration, the first decarbonization plan of the planet after the Paris Agreement. So you see, that opened actually another way of understanding defense, which is not based on tanks or missiles, but based on the system, on the endorsement of the system. And also of, I mean, how dangerous can you be when you cannot invade somebody? But what you can do is speak your mind and try to be consistent. So that's our actual danger to others. That's the danger we represent to others. So that gives a political advantage. Many people tell me, but it's easy to say that knowing that the US is going to protect you. And up until recently, I said, well, that's basically the NATO model. Used to be the NATO model. But even though that, it's a way that you encourage Panama. Panama does not have a large investment in the military. In Panama, after the Noriega regime, Panama also got rid of the military because they don't see necessarily us or us them a threat. But even Nicaragua, which is currently a dictatorship and had passed through that, all that period of war in Nicaragua, just our north border, we did not have an army to, let's say, to justify protecting us from that threat. So yeah, there are trade-offs, but I think it's also very embedded in our way of looking at the world, very singular, I have to admit. Because when any Costa Rican speaks, I mean, when we speak among ourselves, it's like, yeah, it's obvious why to have an army, because everybody's convinced. Actually, my son is part of what, the fourth generation of Costa Ricans that have lived without an army and don't know what it is. And there's no constriction, so it's really embedded in the population and how we approach things.
Carlos, I think you've done a fantastic job of kind of sort of connecting sustainable development and sustainable development investment with that soft power, right? That is kind of sort of a very, effective defense mechanism. There's plenty to unpack still, but I also feel that my colleagues around the table and behind will do a much better job of unpacking it than me. We are going to keep I'm going to keep one question for the very end, which is going to be, given the need to perform an analysis on the impact of militarization on the SDGs, what specific recommendations would you perhaps have for the Secretary General and the team? But prior to that, we'd love to open it up to the group, and therefore I'm handing over to Dan to moderate the next part.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you, President Alvarado. I was writing to a colleague that this is one of those sessions where I think we would all be happy just to listen to you for an hour and a half. It's unusual. I think often we come in and we say, well, where was my voice? I feel like today we're all saying, actually, let's just hear more of his voice. So we will have a chance to get back to you at the end. There are two questions that have not been addressed directly to President Alvarado that I want to focus on a little bit in our open discussion. It's not meant, as you know, it's not meant to be a Q&A session, but actually an open discussion amongst friends and thinkers. Those two questions are in the concept note. One is, given worsening conflict and security challenges globally, what recourse should a country maintain? And what additional development and security investments may be needed now? And then the other question is the one that Michael just referenced, which is, what are some of the key items you would like to see come out of the Secretary General's report this year? So quick comment on format for this. You'll see today we don't have your name cards. Usually we hand out name cards for your organizations and all of this. We're perhaps experimenting accidentally to see if we can make sure that this is really a flat space where you don't know who's an ambassador or a former president, though you might know that one. And you also don't know who's a grassroots representative. In this way, the opinions shared can be those who are making them. It also means that I don't necessarily know everybody's name and organization, so please be generous, as I may just point to you and label you by the color of your clothing. Yes, and this is not meant to be Q&A. Last thing I was going to say is I will alternate between voices online and voices in the room. So if you would like to speak from those joining us on Zoom, there are over 70 of you there. Please feel free to just put your hand up and I will do my best. So for now, we have this gentleman with the blue tie. Thank you.
Thanks so
and
much.
sorry, last thing. Please use your outdoor voice so that those online can hear us.
Great. Thanks so much. Really terrific to hear this. By the way, you have a fantastic PR here.
I
Who's
know.
a strong advocate for disarmament.
I appointed her
and
as deputy, and
You
then
did
she
great.
was.
and Costa Rica really, having spent a long time in the UN, was such a great example of a country that was could invest in education, healthcare, human development, as you call it, despite having a relatively low income, with the state of Kerala in India. So thank you for that. One thing you did not mention, and I'm wondering whether you can comment on that. Latin America has been a relatively peaceful continent since the early 1800s. Of course, there have been wars within countries, as you mentioned, including very close by, but there have hardly been any hot wars between countries, except for the soccer war between Honduras and forgot the other country.
El Salvador.
El Salvador, exactly. And maybe Bolivia and Chile. But that, I think, it really gives, of course, a very important conducive environment to abolishing the army. But I do give Costa Rica a lot of credit for that. One thing I studied was war and peace in the early 1980s, and one thing that came up was, to what extent was non-violent methods to resist military attacks an option that Costa Rica thought about? So that's really a second question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for the lesson and reflections. For once, I have a question and not a comment, but please allow me to do the question. The other day, I watched an interview in Televisión Española with Josep Borrell, which is the former High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs, and many other things. And for half an hour, we listened and they analyzed Ukraine and Gaza and Trump, and there were sentences like, this is not about a number of square kilometers, this is about our whole value system, etc., etc. And the last question that the journalist asked was, so you are recommending that we need to pump up our military and invest more in military. And I'm not sure, the journalist said, in better words, that the Spanish society is going to be very receptive of this. Would you keep to your point? And he made his point and said, yeah, we better. We have to invest more in our military because of the current situation. And I must confess, after half an hour of such a stressful and black picture conversation, I could not build in my head the counter arguments. So my question to you is a plea for help, but my question to you is, can we now really push for demilitarization and less spending in the military in Europe now? And if so, what would be your arguments to convince that Spanish population is quite convinced maybe, but that population to say we still can do it despite the current environment?
Sophia, I rely on you to offer comments and not questions. And now here we have a shift in the narrative. And I promised President Alvarado this would be a discussion. So hopefully
We can be flexible.
it will be flexible, I know. Hopefully Alan and then Barbara online can offer further thoughts that may not be direct questions. And please keep your comments to 2 to 3 minutes so that we have time for many to speak. So Alan, you're welcome to go ahead.
Thank you
Yes,
very
we can
much.
hear you.
I'm Alan Ware with the Welfareist Movement and the World Future Council. And my question is actually a follow-up to Jan Henk, the peaceful history in Latin America. it seems to me also that one of the reasons for that is that most of the Latin American countries accept the compulsory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, and so are able to take their disputes to the court for resolving. So you see a lot of those disputes in the International Court of Justice. And I know Costa Rica has done that themselves, has taken from Nicaragua, for example, to the International Court of Justice for dispute resolution. So the question is that actually a really important tool to be able to use? And is that one of the reasons why there haven't been wars as much in Latin America as there are in other regions? And if so, would you encourage other countries from other regions to also accept the compulsory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice?
Thank you so much, Alan. Barbara, please. I think different Barbara. Oh, then Barbara, fantastic. You're still on mute, Barbara. Let's see if we can.
Oh, thank
there we
you.
go.
Okay. We have a socio-economic paradigm shift, in my opinion, and America are showing us the polarized spectrum that we need to overcome. I mean, basically, what's left of democracy in America is represented by the far left, because both the Democrats and the Republicans are completely an oligarch at the mercy of the wealthy. And I think they're going to come through it. We've got Bernie Sanders talking about wealth inequality and bringing in massive support. So, but basically, the world can't afford the ecological or the financial cost of warring with each other. The existential crisis is so huge, unless we grow up out of the violence. I mean, this is childish behavior that we're seeing from Trump and Putin. They're bully boys, and we just cannot let them run the world anymore. And most people are grown up now, and we just have to bring them with us. By the way, I'm giving a workshop with the Schumacher Institute on the 18th of March. I hope some of you, about paths to paradigm shift.
Thank you, Barbara. We can save advertisements. You can put them in the chat box, actually, so people know how to join, but not in the oral interventions. Please, we'll go to Georgios and then a different Barbara.
Thank you very much. And I had the pleasure of working with Cristiana Figueres, and there is a contribution of Costa Rica also to the Paris Agreement and the climate efforts of the world. But I see now in Europe that the tendency is to increase the defense budget and to cut the development assistance or foreign aid budgets. And I wonder whether that has to be in some way addressed and castigated or criticized, because somehow leaders think that this is the right thing to do. And I noticed with Barbara before, there is a contradiction between trying to say that, of course, there has to be defense against invasions, etc. But when there is no way out, or no way is allowed out, then there is an escalation, even by those who say that they want peace. Could Costa Rica play a role, or is there a critical mass of countries that would really advocate for reduction of armaments under the current circumstances, especially in the North and Europe, where I come from? Thank you.
Thank you, Georgios. And I'm worried about the circuit breaker behind you. You might want to check that light. Barbara, go ahead.
I'm also worried about his circuit breaker. So actually, perhaps trying to make a metaphor out of circuit breaker that might not work. So I should. I'm sort of concerned about the rules-based system because of the imbalances within it and the power imbalances within it, so to speak, and how there is a hierarchy, it appears, in the rule-based system multilaterally. That doesn't really support sustainable development. It's more supportive of trade rules TRIPS, intellectual property rights, moving, if you like, a lot of the rules-based structure ecosystem away from human rights, away from domestic determination, which you described really, really well in terms of Costa Rica. And I think also one of the challenges that we have, which Costa Rica has clearly maintained decision-making and priorities where people have agency. And yet we seem to be in a situation at the moment where so much of what influences people's lives, wherever they are, is not within that space, but is in this kind of cross-border dimension where the weaknesses of the rules-based approach are very, very strong. So I'm not asking a question. I'm doing what Dan told me. No, but really, I think that for the challenges of sustainable peace today and addressing multidimensional violence, I agree that multilateralism doesn't feel very connected to people, but I also am trying all the time to work out how to make it more real for people and how to make sure that there is more of their agency in determining whatever those rules are. And it's tough.
Yes.
Yes, please.
I want to keep the conversation going, not in a specific order, but very lot to think about. On one dimension, the case of Latin America, yes, is very specific because let's say our borders were settled on the colonial process, you know? So that already settled the foundation. Then also the situation of our own conflicts, where we're within, mostly on inequality. We don't use that word a lot, but also caste system. Because in independence, let's say, the higher caste, the Ibericos, were the ones that were expelled, but the rest of the system remained in place. We came with a Republican mind, and everybody was free, independent, no slavery, but the system and the hierarchy mostly remained. So the conflict is within. We are still one of the most unequal, if not the most unequal region of the planet, and very violent within, and drug trafficking and other challenges. Homicide is very high. So we have another set of challenges, locally not among countries, but those challenges obviously need to be addressed. I want to do one disclaimer. I see also because of the question mentions if the experience can be replicated or is desirable to make it replicated, because I often am requested to talk about this, and I don't encourage the replication itself of the model. This has to come, or whatever the pathway is, has to come from the own country to say we're heading into this way or that because it's in our own interest, not to say, oh, let's implement the Costa Rica model and boom, because everybody's got different conditions and that can end up not necessarily well. And that's why I connect so much to what's going on today in the world. I will not argue for the case of absolute disarmament in this world. It will sound very unrealistic and even naive, and won't make any favor to the disarmament and peace argument. But let me offer this argument. This means that in a world that 60 countries out of the 190 in the system are highly indebted and have no fiscal margin to invest on climate change, SDGs, human development, and poverty. Many countries in the planet, especially developing, invest more in interest rates of their already expended loans than in development. Let's put that element here. Which, by the way, are receiving less support because of the shift and the pressure to invest more in arming the world than in development, which it's reducing the finance to address adaptation, mitigation, climate change. And instead of putting resources on energy transition, on renewables, on you name it, on that transformation, on protection of the ecosystems, of nature. You're putting on weapons, you're investing less in the cohesion of societies that might eventually, through conflict or necessity, are going to trigger more migration globally and domestically. So the question is, if we invest more in armament and in weapons, are we contributing to a safer world? I mean, I do agree that we need to invest in a safer world. The question is it a tank? Is it a bomb? Is it a missile? The way to make it safer. And that's what it's the way for us and for politicians to perceive that we are safe, to have a larger stick, to have a larger means of deterrence. But we are contributing on making this world a least safe place. So the answer, we share the same concern. The answer is faulty, in my view. We are not necessarily more secure. How then can we use our resources? Well, we can address many of this, but also we can exercise diplomacy. And this here, I think we need to double click and think again of why we do what we do. I used to have lots of conversations with the Supreme Court Justice of Costa Rica. I was younger and he was very senior, but we get along even though we fight a lot because of budgets and things like that. But he always reflected the necessity for people in positions of power to exercise, I don't know what the appropriate translation in English is, but to exercise self-containment when in positions of power. Why? I see it in my case in Costa Rica. I was not the commander-in-chief of our army, but I'm still the commander-in-chief of the police. There are certain judiciary decisions that require police enforcement, which is under my command. And if I don't accept a systemic ruling, I can say, I can order the police, no, don't do that. And then I trigger a constitutional crisis. Why? Because I'm not self-containing, which I'm faulted. I might be wrong in front of the courts, but still I have the power. But I'll erode in the system. Similar, but that happens across. I mean, judges have the capacity to rule on their own salaries, for example. But when judges start doing things that are not well seen on society, they are going beyond their strength of self-containment. And as Barbara mentioned, when bureaucracies, national or international, don't deliver, they are destroying the system from within. And they are encouraging the guys with the chainsaw saying, let's cut all of this, take those taxes and send it back to people, as if they were going to do that. We need to challenge the bureaucracy also from itself to deliver to people. I've seen how many bureaucracies of many levels say, no, but my mandate is this. But my rule, yes, that has to be, but we need also to read either the Constitution or the Charter because those are to serve people. If people stop endorsing the systems, the rules-based systems ends. But if there's no rule-based system, what is the system that remains? Is the power-based system, the strength-based system. That's why the people that endorse, in the case of the rules international systems, the systems are the small ones, because they know that if there are no rules, they are at the mercy of power. But also, a rule-based system chances are that delivers peace because you know that instead to having to arm to make your point, you arm a set of diplomats or lawyers to make good arguments, and journalists too, or communicators to express your arguments to the peoples, so you can make moral stance. Especially in democracies. I mean, small countries don't have that power, but listen to the Pacific Islands making points on climate change. Why? Because they are literally disappearing, they're drowning. So when they stand in any large democracy and say, your emissions are destroying us, what is it they're going to do about it? People listen, because we're also humans. There's still solidarity among us, empathy.
Well, I don't know how to come back from that. So we have Rose, who is online and would like to ask a question, and I'm still looking around for other comments in the room. Rose.
I'm listening. I'm going to grab some.
She lowered her hand. Okay. Are there other questions? Please. Or statements.
Not necessarily a question. I want to kind of comment on what Barbara was saying, because I absolutely agree there are fundamental flaws in our rules-based system. Firstly, I'd like to say it's important that we have the rule of law and not the rule by law. But I think what's important here, and commenting on what you were saying, is that this is a good example of the rules-based system mirroring social change. There was social mandate, there was political will to demilitarize the country. And I think that what we need more of is systems which shift according to the will of the people. And I think where we have a problem, what you were saying about the inequality, is when it's the few that are represented in these systems and not the many. And so I think, you know, particularly with what you were saying about just now about the Pacific Islands and climate change, having a rules-based order that mirrors and that responds to the trends that we're seeing in the world, specifically if you look at military, the increasing use of the environment as a weapon of war, looking at how we can deal with this through the rules-based system. I work with Costa International, so this is one key example of this that's very current. But yeah, I think the key thing is that absolutely there are flaws with the rules-based system, but as you were saying, what do we have if we don't have this? And so for me, the important thing is that we have a rules-based system that mirrors the will of the people and not the few.
Thank you. And I see Rose has now unmuted. Go ahead, Rose.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so glad I didn't have to follow the president. He was so eloquent in everything that he was saying. But I wanted to share with you, because I think I'd be remiss if I didn't make these comments. I'm a retired military officer, a senior military officer, and I'm also a retired professor of human security. So I've had a chance to evolve in this humanitarian space, and I have an NGO that provides well-being and resilience to children that are in climate issue, that are dealing with climate issues. And I just attended the Rotary Presidential Peace Conference in Istanbul, so I feel like I'm pretty current on this topic. I'd like to remind everyone that, you know, in the United States, the military works for civilian leaders. They don't operate independently. They work for the lawmakers, policymakers, the people that you vote into Congress, and the president, of course. So the military just responds to what they're told to do. And our concept in the United States has been one about having a strong military, because you need that for defense and for deterrence. And that has proven historically to be to our advantage if we protect our country, you know, and of course, there's a lot of debate about what we're doing internationally now, but there has been a reason for that, to self-guard democracy and hopefully to do it through diplomacy. But I just wanted to share those comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rose. Perhaps, yes, Dennis, go ahead.
What are you doing now to try and get world peace? And how can I, as a Rotarian and other Rotarians, help you in your efforts?
I think, Hank, you want to jump in again? I was going to advertise what he's doing now anyway.
So, I mean, on the rules-based system, I just wanted to mention one footnote to that, and that's, you know, there are some member states across the streets who are really arguing that the rules-based system was a Western invention, and that we need a system based on international law and the UN Charter, which I think is and that's partly reflecting, the point that Barbara made, is that there is a huge inequality in the system, and it partly, reflects the power. But that's exactly what the rule of law is about, right? The rule of law is about equality before the law, irrespective of how rich or poor you are, or how wealthy or not, or have military power or not. That's of course not the reality, but that is the ideal, and that is what is so important in arguing that this is really what is really key to the multilateral system. I'm always very happy that the ambassador of Singapore always starts his speech with, us as small countries are absolutely relying on the rule of law as the basis of the multilateral system. That's existential for us. But there is a distinction between the international law and the international system based on rules that are less strong than that law, legal aspects.
I want to perhaps also offer a thought or intervention, and this is really taking advantage of the trust of this community in offering sort of an exploratory notion, which is that of collective security. And I raise it because I think about examples where you had geographic borders that had been the cause of conflict, but then were no longer the cause of conflicts. What shifts and what may be necessary for that shift to happen? Because one can imagine at the macro scale now we have 193 independent countries. Some of them sometimes decide that they want to encroach on their neighbor. What higher power is there to prevent them from doing so? And you think about the United States, and it's like 200 years ago when there were state militias. How did those state militias essentially go away? I mean, constitutionally, they're not gone, and we know the Second Amendment and all of this. We also have Europe, which for centuries was a concert of war, nation against nation. What has shifted so that within those, for the most part in Western Europe anyway, there hasn't been war between states? And I wonder if there's a certain degree to which this notion of true collective security is one that can allow for permission, in a sense, to disarm. I'm not sure what that would look like now, especially because there's perhaps a legitimate sense of mistrust of what could be a global military force. I hesitate even to say that, but it's just maybe a thought exercise about, if we're saying disarm or arm, are there third ways that we may want to explore that could ensure that peace is maintained without just trusting that everybody will disarm? I'm not sure either, but I wanted to offer it in this space. So perhaps,
If I may?
oh yes, go ahead.
There are people that address this from the framework of game theory, or, I'm not that, because I think when we start addressing it like that, we alienate lots of people. You say, you need to know that theory to understand. But I think usually this, I've sensed that there's some counterintuitive two steps are pathways into get those security. I mean, it's the typical dilemma of, if you don't have a gun, well, I don't have to work, you don't have to spend on that, I don't have to spend on that, and we both feel safer. But then that requires something you cannot measure scientifically, which is trust. Similar to the system, this self-containment on the exercise of power is because you trust the system, but also because you get benefits on the system itself. In this round of the system, I lost an election, but I know that in the next one, I might participate and win. Or this particular judiciary case I lost, but I know there are some guarantees to me or to others, or I can win. So there's an endorsement on the system, but that's very subjective. Trust, it's how you measure trust. I mean, there you can go, you make a survey. Yes, you can do that. But that you build trust. Again, that I emphasize, when people stop feeling that those systems deliver for them, they withdraw the trust. Now, the main danger of the systems is not necessarily, I mean, the escalation, it's not, or the threats to system or democracy, it's not coming like it used from the military to the democracy. It's coming from within the democracy. That's the thing. And certain political stance benefit from that mistrust to build an agenda. That's why my message also is to push back on, if we believe the system, we need to make sure not only that the system exists, but it delivers to the people concretely. I mean, we use, I critique that a lot in general of, we use lots of acronyms, and then people don't understand what is it we do all the time in meetings and say, why don't we take all those salaries, all that money and do something else with it? Because people don't get a connection between that and peace, that and development, that and me. So we need to make that connection more clear. Usually when people are confronted, I remember Costa Rica had years back a dispute with Nicaragua, and there were some forces of Nicaragua crossing the border. And then people were saying, what, the system has to do so. Well, then they felt that now the system needs to work. I think that also this, as the UN, was possible because it was very evident back then what we were moving apart from. We were coming out as humanity and as a planet after a big hangover, not only of conflict, but of populism and of lots of things that gave the margin to say we want something different. We want to build something different. But that was also 3-4 generations ago. So many people, the last people that were alive there are just here to say what it was. But most of us did not experience that. That memory is also part of how can we build trust in that collective. Trust is key if we are to move into that direction.
Unfortunately, I think that we're kind of sort of reaching our limit in time. So thank you so much for those core contributions. I did want to end potentially with kind of sort of a synthesis of all that, not by me, but by you, but a couple of things that kind of sort of I thought were particularly interesting. You were not necessarily advocating it, but you certainly brought up kind of sort of this idea of an anti-interventionist model and the need for these things to play out in any individual society, as they did essentially in Costa Rica. You alluded to kind of sort of the many factors that kind of sort of need to be considered and come into play, avoiding the topics like complexity theory and so on, precisely because of the fact that they're alienating. One of the things that resonated most with me, perhaps, was this, talking about the issue as the most effective way of making the world a safer place. And understanding that there's a spectrum, right, from a sort of a more secure but repressive kind of sort of system to one that's equally secure but potentially more free, and then kind of an invariable middle ground, which every country will kind of fall between. I just wanted to revert very quickly back to Rose's comments earlier on. One of the things that we would like to do potentially as the next part of this series is actually invite perhaps a more militaristic perspective to be able to kind of sort of, counterbalance some of those underlying dynamics. Lastly, going back to that loss of soft power, I definitely feel that there's a lot of opportunity to unpack this idea of studying how and when the loss of soft power becomes more valuable than what you stand to win, either by a military intervention or alternatively simply by maintaining the military as well. So I think that aspect is absolutely fascinating. In 30 seconds or less, if I could ask you to synthesize the single recommendation that you would ask of the Secretary General in his analysis and that of the team, and then I'd like to hand it over to Lily. Close.
No, thank you. Thank you all for being here and bearing with me and with we all. My recommendation goes in that direction of challenging the notion that arming makes you more secure. It's just not the answer. If we were to actually de-escalate and use those fiscal margins to address an existential threat as climate change or loss of biodiversity, if we use that to address the existential threats of the people that are the most vulnerable, then you start building a more secure planet for all of us. It's also a rational argument. I think that at first nobody will listen, but then I always like to quote, not quote, but give the example of Mandela. I mean, nobody listened to him for how long? Or to that movement, and then they changed. Literally, they changed their country, and they give an example to all of us in the means of non-violence. And I mean, even though it was put in. So I think it's making the case of why de-escalation, it's not only morally good, some of us will go with the moral, but not all, but it's rationally good. And those investments improve our security multidimensionally. But you have to make the case and be persistent. It's not only about not thinking that one has the right argument. It's about being persistent and persisting and persisting and persisting and going on and on and on. It's not, you can be right one, but then if nobody agrees with you, you need to be persistent at this. Peace requires persistence.
Thank you so much, President Alvarado, and thank you, Dan. Thank you so much, President Alvarado, and thank you, Michael, and the colleagues at the Institute for Economics and Peace for joining us in this conversation. I got it right that time. It's certainly not an easy topic to be discussing, particularly today, but I think that certainly shouldn't get in the way of us starting the conversation. And hopefully this is really a conversation that we're all beginning. And I think UNODA has called for other organizations to have similar conversations. And if you have the chance to also articulate your thoughts in the form of papers, you're welcome to submit those. And we look forward to continue the conversation with you. And we'd like to thank you again for spending time with us this afternoon. Thank you so much. Oh, and
two very quick things. One, I want to say that Professor Alvarado is a professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He can be found there. He teaches courses on small state interventions at the international level. I also see our colleague from UN Office of Development Affairs.
Yes.
Quickly,
Thank you very much. Really quick. Thank you very much for the Baha'i community to organize this meeting together with IEP. Just a quick update regarding the call for papers. The deadline for submitting papers has been extended until the 31st of March. So I invite experts to send papers. Thank you very much.
thank you.